Hey everybody, it's Scott Shetler here at Extreme Performance Training Systems in Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome to this week's episode of Strength and Health TV. In this week's episode, I want to talk about the rack deadlift or the rack pull and how we use it here in the training of my clients, my lifters, and my athletes. Now the rack deadlift is a partial deadlift done out of your power rack with the bar sitting on the spot pins. And generally, for instance, with the rack that we use, we set the spot pins so that it places the plates of the bar so that they're 2, 4, 6 inches off the ground. Those are the heights that we typically pull from, whether we're using this as a max effort exercise or if we're using it in the speed deadlift rotation, or even if we're just using it as a supplementary or assistance exercise. If we go much higher than that, it gets the bar above the knees, and I really don't find much value in that personally. Some people do like that for the overload that you can get, but the way that we're implementing the rack pull is in a way such that it's building the lower back. All right, so one of the tips that I picked up from Louie Simmons when I visited Westside Barbell and I was working on my deadlift up there, he was telling me about how to use rack pulls and why some people use them in what he feels is an incorrect manner. And what he told me was that when you set the barbell up in the rack and the plates are already elevated off the ground, that oftentimes people will do the rack pull just like they do the deadlift from the ground, meaning that if they've got the plates set 4 or 6 inches off the ground, they pull the bar like they're starting on the ground. So they drop the hips way down and they use a ton of leg drive to break the bar off the pins. And he feels that that's not the correct way to do it. What he told me to do was to, wherever the bar is set in the rack, to get your body in the same position that it would be in when you've got the bar that far off the ground on the deadlift. So basically what the rack pull's doing, it's eliminating leg drive and it's shifting a lot of load to the back. So we often find that as a result of implementing the rack pulls in that manner, that we're not able to pull anywhere near what we can off the ground. And as the rack pull goes up, we know that we're making our lower back stronger, and that's contributing positively to deadlift because it is a lift that mimics the primary exercise. So this is a little bit different than pulling with the barbell set with the plates on blocks. You know, we do block pulls quite a bit here as well, where we'll typically set the plates on the deadlift platform on blocks that are 2 inches or 4 inches high. And when you pull the bar off the blocks, the bar is going to flex just like it does when you pull the bar off the ground. Whereas when you're doing a rack pull, you've got the bar actually sitting on the spot pins, so it's a completely different feeling because the plates aren't sitting on anything. So they're two different exercises, and I find that they're both great to work into the rotation for the exercises that you're using to build the deadlift. So in this video, again, I want to focus mainly on the rack pull, and I want to talk about some things that the way to set up in the rack and how to use the proper technique to lift the weights so that you're taking the leg drive out and you are shifting the load to the back. Now, as far as implementation, we typically work these in on max effort day as a primary exercise, where we take a max 1 rep, whether the bar is sitting on the 3, the 2, or the 1 pin. We have records at each one of those. We always try to break those every time that lift cycles around in our max effort rotation. We might also use it as a supplementary exercise sometimes, where it's going to be a secondary exercise after the main lift. And typically, when that's the case, we're going to use somewhere around 80%, 75 to 85%. We're going to usually do about 3 to 5 sets of 3 to 5 reps and use it as more of a strength building exercise. And then we also use it on dynamic effort day. Typically after we do our dynamic effort box squats, we're going to do some sort of speed deadlift, whether it's with the barbell on the deadlift platform where we're pulling against bands or chains, whether we're pulling sumo or conventional. We might put the plates on a 2-inch mat, pull against bands, sumo or conventional, or we might do speed deadlifts out of the rack where we quadruple up the mini bands or the micro minis, put them around the bar and do our speed pulls out of the rack. Typically the volume on our dynamic effort deadlifts is going to be somewhere about 20 total reps in the workout. We'll typically do 10 doubles or 7 triples. Sometimes we'll do 5 sets of 4 or 4 sets of 5 just to vary the rep ranges a little bit, but usually we're doing 10 doubles or 7 triples with the speed deadlifts. When we're doing them in the rack or whether we're doing them on the platform, we typically use about 30% band tension and then we use about 50% bar weight, so we're getting about 80% total loading at the top of the lift and using the bands, of course, to accommodate the resistance. So I want to go ahead and demo the rack deadlift here and just kind of talk about some of the technique points that you want to pay attention to when you're using this exercise. Like I said, the key point here is you want to make sure that you're not setting up like you're doing a regular deadlift from the ground. We want to take the leg drive out of the exercise so that we're shifting the load to the lower back. So let's go ahead and take a look at the lift. Like I said, when you're setting up, you don't want to set up like you're doing a regular conventional deadlift and get your hips really, really low. So you don't want to grab the bar and get your hips way down and use a lot of leg drive to pull the bar up. You want to look at where the bar is, where the plates are off the ground, and you want to get your body into as close to the position that it would be in as it would be during a deadlift when the bar is that far off the ground. So again, we want to use this to load up the lower back and build strength in the lower back. So when I set up, generally what I do is I grab the bar, I drop my hips a little bit, and I start to load the back, and then I pull straight up to the lockout. So again, what you're seeing there is a lot of hip flexion and extension, very little bit of knee movement. I'm just unlocking the knees enough to get down and grab the bar so that I'm placing a lot of load on the back when I do the lift. If I drop my hips really low and use a lot of leg drive, it completely changes the dynamics of the lift. When I do it that way, I'm basically turning it into a variation of a leg press, and I'm feeling a lot more in the quads and the thighs and very little in the lower back. So just to reiterate, that is the one huge key that really changed this exercise for me, as my lower back's always been my weak point in the deadlift. All the pulling we do out of the rack is done in a conventional stance so that we can really, bend over at the hips and get a lot of load on the lower back. Now, as far as resistance goes, like I said, we're typically going to use straight weight when we're using this as a max effort exercise or a secondary or a supplementary exercise, but we can use bands or chains on the bar as well to overload the lift a little bit. Generally, you're going to use bands when we're pulling out of the rack, so I want to show how we set those up. Most of the time, we're going to use a regular mini band or a micro mini band. When these are set up, the mini bands give about 220 pounds of tension at the top of the lift. So basically, you're just going to take your band and then fold it in half, and then just grab the two ends. All right, so you got the band folded in half, drop it over the bar, and then grab the two ends and pull it under the sumo base of your rack, and then bring them back up over the bar so that you've got the bands attached to the bar looped under the sumo base. Again, when you do this, it's going to add about 220 pounds of tension at the lockout, which is great if you have an issue at the lockout with your grip and your lower back. So again, to set up the band, you're just going to double the band, fold it in half, drop it over the bar, and then take both ends, pull it under the sumo base of your rack, bring them up over the collar, right back onto the bar, and you're set up and ready to go. So again, this doesn't change how you do the exercise, but the tension's going to come on fast and really overload the top of the lift. So again, when we're doing the rack pulls, you want to make sure that we're turning this into mostly a lower back emphasis exercise by taking out the leg drive. You're going to set up with your feet about hip width apart or your normal conventional stance, shins up close to the bar, folding at the hips. Grab the bar and get tight, load up the back. Then drive your hips through to the lockout. So again, the addition of the bands really overloads the top of the movement and is great if you've got lockout issues. So hopefully that clears up any questions that you might have had or any reservations that you might have about using the rack deadlift or the rack pull in your training. Again, don't make it a leg exercise. Take out the leg drive and make it a back exercise. That's what it's intended to do, and when you do that, I think what you'll find is that you'll build a lot of strength in your back that's going to carry over to the deadlift. So a lot of people will say that because it's not the actual lift itself, there's not going to be any carryover. But I think all these special variations of the exercises of the main squat, bench, and deadlift that we implement, they are performed in a similar pattern, and they do carry over to the lift. You just want to make sure that you don't just get hung up on one or two. You need to rotate through a bunch and find out what works for you. And hopefully you'll give rack deadlifts done this way a shot, because we've seen a huge improvement in our lifts. I've got a 114-pound girl that I train. Her deadlift's up to about 265 now, and she just keeps breaking records. One of our heavier lifters, he's built his in about a year's time. He took his deadlift up to 655 in a competition raw. Rack pulls are huge, but he's a sumo puller, and what we found is that doing rack pulls with a conventional stance really drove his lifts up because it strengthened his lower back and worked muscles that he's typically not working when he's working the sumo. I've got a guy who's competed at the 114, 123s, and the 132 class. And at 114, he had a 425 deadlift, and rack pulls are a huge part of his lift because he's usually weak at the top, so the rack pulls really built his lockout, and using the bands really overloads the grip as well. Being so small, he does have small hands, so his grip's an issue. And when the band is actively trying to pull that bar out of your hands, it builds a huge amount of grip strength. So there's a lot of benefits to doing this variation of the deadlift. Hopefully it'll find a point in your rotation of your primary exercises, and hopefully this video helped clear up some of the technique issues with performing the rack pull. So hopefully you enjoyed this week's video. If you got any questions or comments, just leave them in the comments section below the video. And if you've got any suggestions on future show episodes or topics, go ahead and leave those in the comments section as well. And as always, stay strong and stay healthy.